They used to whisper about it after dark. In McDowell County, West Virginia, when the fog rolled down from the ridges and the hollows disappeared beneath layers of gray silence, people would lower their voices and say there was a place where faith had gone too far to remain human. A place where bloodlines folded inward. A place where prayer and isolation twisted into something unrecognizable. This is the story of Jonah and Lydia Blackwood. And it begins in 1952, hidden deep inside the Appalachian Mountains, where poverty clung to the hillsides like moss, and forgotten American dreams lay buried beneath coal dust and broken promises. Welcome to our investigation into one of the darkest chapters of human genealogy. Today, we return to a community where family lines blurred beyond distinction, where devotion became doctrine, and where suffering echoed across generations. The Blackwoods were not always outcasts. Historical records show that their ancestors arrived in the region during the coal boom of the 1880s. Like thousands of others, they came searching for stability, work, and a future carved from stone and sweat. Timothy Blackwood was one of them. A miner with hardened hands and hopeful eyes, he brought his wife Margaret and their 3 children into the mountains believing perseverance would bring prosperity. Instead, they found isolation. Cold winters. Empty pockets. Roads that vanished into mud. Towns that slowly emptied. By 1925, what had once been a modest homestead had transformed into a cluster of collapsing cabins, housing more than 20 relatives stretched across 3 generations. Survival no longer meant expansion. It meant retreat. County records from the era reveal something troubling. The Blackwoods had almost completely withdrawn from neighboring communities. Local historian Dr. Eliza Cartwright explains. Their isolation wasn't only physical. Over time, they developed their own speech patterns, their own customs, and most disturbingly, their own religious interpretations that justified keeping their bloodline sealed within itself. Outsiders, they believed, carried spiritual corruption. Contact meant contamination. And within that belief, a dangerous doctrine took root. Photographs from a 1932 regional census provide haunting evidence. Children with hollow eyes. Faces marked by unusual proportions. Prominent brow ridges. Narrow-set eyes. Underdeveloped jaws. These were not accidents of nature. They were the visible consequences of generations of genetic recycling, where the same fragile code was passed down again and again, until flaws multiplied. This was the world Jonah Blackwood was born into. He arrived in 1924, the 3rd son of cousins Elijah and Ruth Ann Blackwood. Church documents note that from early childhood, Jonah displayed unusual intelligence. He read scripture obsessively. Memorized sermons. Quoted verses long before he could fully comprehend them. But his body betrayed him. He walked with a pronounced limp. His vision faded early. Pain followed him everywhere. His sister Lydia was born 2 years later. Where Jonah was sharp and intense, Lydia was gentle and distant. Medical notes suggest limited cognitive development. Learning delays. Emotional fragility. Yet family journals speak of something else. They describe her voice. A soft, haunting singing voice that drifted through the hills at night. Some relatives claimed it could calm animals. Others said it sounded like prayer itself. By the time World War II reshaped the nation, Appalachia remained largely untouched. While young men left for distant battlefields, Jonah stayed behind. He was deemed unfit for service. As coal mines closed and jobs vanished, families fled toward cities. The Blackwoods did the opposite. They withdrew further. Deeper into the hollow. Further from oversight. Further from intervention. Geneticist Dr. Thomas Harrington later reviewed medical fragments from this period. What we see, he explains, is a classic case of genetic collapse. Recessive traits that usually remain hidden began surfacing en masse. Developmental delays. Skeletal deformities. Heart defects. Neurological impairments. Each generation suffered more than the last. In 1949, the outside world finally took notice. County nurse Evelyn Porter received reports of gravely ill children living in the hollow. Against warnings, she ventured up the mountain. Her journal remains preserved in state archives. Her first entry reads, "The condition of these people defies medical description. Several children suffer from illnesses I have never encountered. Most disturbing is their acceptance of these afflictions as God's will." When Porter attempted to explain the dangers of close familial relationships, she was confronted by Jonah. By then, he had assumed spiritual authority. He called himself the missionary. He claimed God spoke to him through dreams. He preached preservation, purity, sacred blood. He insisted the family had been chosen. When Porter refused to retreat, she was driven away. By 1950, Jonah's influence had hardened into absolute control. At 26, his body was failing. His spine curved unnaturally. His eyesight reduced to vague shadows. But his voice carried power. His sermons grew longer, more intense, more absolute. Charisma rose as health declined. Sheriff's reports from this era document repeated attempts by social services to investigate the compound. Each time, they were turned back, sometimes violently. Meanwhile, Lydia transformed. Neighbors who glimpsed her from a distance described her as strangely beautiful, childlike, fragile, frozen between girlhood and adulthood. Though 24, her body remained small. Her mind, evaluators later concluded, resembled that of a young child. Yet those who encountered her spoke of an unsettling radiance, a purity that felt almost unnatural. A rare photograph from a regional newspaper captures her seated on the cabin porch. Grainy, blurred, yet unforgettable. A tiny frame, an oversized head, hands clutching a ragged doll, eyes staring somewhere far beyond the camera. Historian Dr. Margaret Wilkins has studied the Blackwood case extensively. What makes Jonah and Lydia's story unique, she notes, is how spiritual devotion evolved into biological destruction. Recovered fragments of Jonah's handwritten sermons reveal a theology stitched together from misread scripture, local superstition, and delusion. He preached about vessels of purity, chosen blood, divine lineage. He framed isolation as holiness, and obedience as salvation. Former neighbor Harold Jenkins recalled years later, "You'd hear singing at strange hours. Pretty, but wrong somehow." Jonah would come down to trade, always quoting Bible verses, but twisted, like he'd bent them into something dark. By 1951, the Blackwood compound was fully sealed off. They grew their own food, distilled medicine from wild plants, refused all government assistance. Tax records note severe decay. Only Jonah's cabin and a converted barn, now called the Temple, received maintenance. Then, in September 1951, a traveling doctor named James Montgomery made the climb. What he found would change everything. Dr. James Montgomery reached the Blackwood Hollow on a grey September afternoon. Clouds clung to the mountains like damp cloth. The dirt road vanished into weeds long before he reached the compound. He abandoned his vehicle and continued on foot, carrying only a medical bag and a growing sense of unease. What awaited him at the end of that trail would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his official report to county authorities, Montgomery wrote, "I encountered approximately 15 individuals exhibiting various stages of physical malformation consistent with generations of inbreeding." But his private journal tells a darker story. He described children with swollen joints, adults with twisted spines, faces that seemed unfinished, as though nature itself had grown tired halfway through their creation. Most disturbing was the man who greeted him. Jonah Blackwood. Thin to the point of transparency. Bones visible beneath stretched skin. Eyes clouded and unfocused. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried authority, certainty, reverence. Jonah introduced Lydia as both his sister and his wife. She stood beside him silently, her fingers knotted into her dress, her eyes fixed on the ground. Montgomery noted that she appeared pregnant. When he attempted to explain the medical dangers of their union, Jonah interrupted. He quoted scripture. He spoke of divine purpose, of sacred testing, of chosen vessels. Within minutes, armed relatives surrounded the doctor. He was escorted from the property at gunpoint. His report triggered a formal investigation. But in rural Appalachia of the early 1950s, bureaucracy moved slowly. By the time officials assembled a response team in early 1952, irreversible damage had already been done. Lydia gave birth to twins that winter. A boy and a girl. The attending midwife, herself a cousin, later testified that both infants showed severe deformities. The boy survived only 3 days. His body simply failed. The girl lived. Dr. Harrington later explained. In sibling reproduction, genetic overlap is so extreme that harmful traits become almost inevitable. Survival itself becomes unlikely. Jonah interpreted the tragedy differently. To him, the boy's death was not biology. It was sacrifice. A divine trial. He intensified his preaching. He fasted. He prayed. He declared that the surviving daughter, whom he named Faith, would become the mother of a purified generation. Community historian Martha Collins later noted, "What's often overlooked is how many people knew something was wrong. They just believed it wasn't their place to interfere. Locals avoided the hollow. Shopkeepers stopped asking questions. Authorities hesitated. A fatalism settled over the region. As winter deepened in early 1952, the compound fell unnaturally quiet. Smoke still rose from chimneys. But no one came down to town. No trading. No church visits. No sightings. Even Jonah disappeared. For nearly 2 months, the Blackwoods vanished from public view. Then came February. A brutal snowstorm sealed the mountains for weeks. Roads collapsed. Communication ceased. When the thaw finally arrived, county worker Thomas Bailey was dispatched to deliver overdue tax notices. He never expected what he found. Bailey later stated, "I saw abandoned cabins. Broken doors. No movement. When I looked through a window, I saw people lying inside who didn't move." He returned immediately to town. Authorities organized a welfare check. Sheriff Robert Aldridge. Nurse Evelyn Porter. 2 deputies. They reached the compound on February 19, 1952. What they discovered stunned even seasoned professionals. Porter's medical report reads like a catalogue of neglect. Severe malnutrition. Untreated infections. Advanced respiratory illness. Children under 10 with profound developmental abnormalities. Signs of prolonged starvation. But one patient concerned her most. Lydia Blackwood. 26 years old. Catatonic. Emaciated. Arms and legs covered in infected wounds. Her infant daughter barely clinging to life. Sheriff Aldridge's report described the converted barn. Inside, Jonah had created what he called the temple. Walls covered in handwritten scripture. Genealogical charts tracing bloodlines. Symbols marking pure unions. Religious imagery fused with family portraits. A shrine to isolation. When authorities attempted to remove Lydia and the children for treatment, Jonah intervened. His body had deteriorated further. His weight dangerously low. His speech slurred. Yet his resolve remained unbroken. He declared that worldly powers had no authority over the chosen bloodline. Medical help, he insisted, was spiritual contamination. Dr. Eleanor Reynolds, a psychiatric historian, explains. Jonah's beliefs reflect a convergence of genetic vulnerability, malnutrition, religious extremism, and isolation. His theology became a closed system, immune to evidence. The standoff lasted hours. Family members pleaded. Officers negotiated. Porter begged. It ended only when Lydia collapsed. Her body finally surrendered. Photographs from the ambulance transport show a woman so frail that paramedics mistook her for a child. Faith was strapped to her chest. Her facial features already bore signs of genetic abnormality. At Welsh Community Hospital, doctors fought to stabilize them. Records indicate multiple emergencies. Severe dehydration. Systemic infection. Psychological dissociation. Self-harm rituals encouraged by religious doctrine. Lydia drifted in and out of consciousness. She whispered hymns. Recited fragments of Jonah's sermons. Faith was placed in emergency foster care. Medical examination revealed congenital heart defects. Skeletal malformations. Neurological impairment. One physician wrote, "This child represents the endpoint of generational genetic isolation." While Lydia received treatment, authorities returned to the compound. Jonah had barricaded himself inside the temple. Several loyal relatives joined him. What followed was a tense, 36-hour negotiation. Fearing violence, Sheriff Aldridge enlisted local pastor William Harrison. Harrison later recounted. He spoke of divine bloodlines, of sacred vessels, of destiny written in flesh. Jonah showed him journals, lineage charts, religious symbols marking each incestuous union. He insisted that his relationship with Lydia fulfilled a prophecy generations in the making. Then, suddenly, silence. After 12 hours without movement, authorities entered. They found Jonah and 3 male relatives dead. Beside them, empty containers. Medical examination identified a mixture of toxic plants. Water hemlock. Foxglove. Poisonous roots. A self-administered ritual. A final act of devotion. The remaining family members were taken into custody. Medical screenings revealed widespread genetic damage. Immune deficiencies. Organ malformations. Developmental delays. Dr. Harrington summarized. Each generation compounded the damage. By the end, collapse was inevitable. News of the Blackwood tragedy faded quickly. County officials feared stigma. Survivors were dispersed. Names altered. Records sealed. Lydia remained hospitalized for 6 months. She rarely spoke. But when she did, she sang. Or repeated Jonah's words, as though his voice still lived inside her. By the spring of 1953, the Blackwood case had moved from emergency response to legal uncertainty. Doctors had stabilized the survivors. Social workers had scattered them across facilities. And county officials now faced a question no statute had prepared them for. What do you do with a family whose entire existence had been shaped by isolation, genetic collapse, and religious extremism? Court records from Welsh reveal months of hearings, evaluations, and internal debate. Judge Howard Williamson addressed the dilemma directly. This court stands in uncharted territory. We are dealing with individuals whose lives raise profound questions about autonomy, competency, and public responsibility. There were no easy answers. Lydia Blackwood became the focal point. Physically, she improved. She gained weight. Her wounds healed. Her infections cleared. But mentally, she remained trapped. Psychiatric evaluations described her as existing in a liminal space between awareness and delusion. She understood simple routines. She responded to kindness. But her worldview remained dominated by Jonah's theology. Blood purity. Chosen lineage. Sacred suffering. Doctors noted that separation from her handmade dolls triggered panic. She referred to them as her children. Held them for hours. Rocked them. Sang to them. In late 1953, Lydia was declared legally incompetent. She was transferred to Green Valley State Hospital. There, she would remain for over 20 years. Meanwhile, authorities struggled with the fate of her daughter, Faith Blackwood. Born fragile. Dependent on constant medical care. Court documents reveal multiple failed placement attempts. Foster families withdrew. Facilities lacked resources. Her prognosis remained uncertain. After emergency surgeries, she was transferred to the Children's Home Society of West Virginia. Adoption prospects were considered minimal. Dr. Wilkins later explained. Children born of incest in high-profile cases were often erased from public systems. Redacted. Renamed. Hidden. Faith became one of them. After 1953, her records fade into fragments. The rest of the Blackwood survivors, nearly 20 individuals, entered rehabilitation programs. Welfare reports paint a bleak picture. Limited education. Poor social skills. Chronic health problems. Deep mistrust of outsiders. Many viewed doctors as enemies. Therapy as temptation. Some adapted slowly. Others never did. Several eventually returned to remote mountain living. Not communally, but still isolated. The original compound was condemned. Nature reclaimed it quickly. By the late 1950s, only collapsed beams and stone foundations remained. In 1957, anthropologist Dr. Samuel Richardson gained permission to document the site before demolition. His field notes describe a community organized around devotion. Sleeping quarters arranged by a spiritual rank. Proximity to Jonah's room signified holiness. The temple contained the most disturbing artifacts. Hand-drawn bloodline charts. Journals justifying incest. Crude medical tools. Homemade birthing devices. Religious banners stitched from scraps. Photographs now stored in university archives show overgrown gardens and abandoned classrooms. A small schoolhouse contained primers and hymnals. Filtered education. Controlled knowledge. Perhaps most haunting was Richardson's discovery of a hidden room. Inside, children's drawings. Toys. Lesson plans written in Lydia's hand. Despite her limitations, she had tried to teach. To create normalcy. To protect. Even as the system collapsed around her. By the end of the 1950s, public memory of the Blackwoods had faded. But medical professionals continued to study the case. In 1958, Dr. Elizabeth Montgomery wrote in the Journal of Rural Medicine. The Blackwood family represents a perfect storm of geographic isolation, cultural separation, religious justification, and genetic reinforcement. Few communities displayed such extreme convergence. In 1962, a follow-up study attempted to locate former members. Of 19 identified survivors, only 11 could be found. 3 had died from congenital complications. Some had integrated with support. Others lived quietly on society's margins. Public health nurse Margaret Wilson wrote, "Even a decade later, genetic consequences remain evident. Independence remains fragile. Faith's trail remained deliberately obscured. Cross-reference records suggest she remained institutionalized." A 1970 caseworker note mentions, "Female ward, age 18, genetic complications, transferred to adult supportive living. No name. No photo. Just a line." In 1972, journalist Robert Campbell began researching Appalachian poverty. During interviews in McDowell County, he kept hearing fragments. Whispers. References to the Hollow family. Intrigued, he began digging. His investigation led him to Green Valley State Hospital. Initially denied access, he eventually obtained permission from Lydia's guardian. His notes offer a rare glimpse into her later life. She appeared older than her years. Small. Stooped. Hands trembling. Facial features still marked by genetic inheritance. She spoke softly, often drifting between clarity and scripture. When Campbell referred to Jonah as her brother, she corrected him. "My husband in God's eyes. We were chosen." When asked about faith, her demeanor changed. She became briefly lucid. "They took my faith," she said. "She was perfect. I sing to her. She answers in the wind." Hospital staff later admitted she maintained elaborate fantasies. That her daughter lived among the chosen. Waiting. In truth, medical files revealed Faith had died in 1967. Age 15. Congenital heart failure. Campbell expanded his research. He interviewed social workers, doctors, deputies, clergy. Their memories painted a system unprepared for complexity. Former Deputy Thomas Grant admitted, "We waited too long. Back then, mountain families were left alone. Those kids never had a chance." Dr. Harrington reviewed Campbell's findings. He wrote, "After 5 generations of consanguinity, nearly all known risks manifested. Infant mortality, immune failure, cognitive decline. Religion accelerated what biology had begun." In October 1974, Lydia Blackwood died. Age 48. Early onset dementia. Possibly genetic. Until the end, she sang hymns, recited Jonah's words, clung to ritual. Among her possessions, nurses found a small wooden box. Inside were unsent letters to Faith, cloth dolls, and a family tree, drawn in childlike handwriting. Every incestuous union marked with religious symbols. A legacy mapped in ink. The Blackwood property, abandoned since 1952, slowly surrendered to the forest. By 1980, county surveys recorded only the faintest traces: stone foundations, rusted tools, fragments of weathered papers. The cabins themselves had vanished. Nature had swallowed their human history, leaving only a quiet, eerie emptiness among the ridges. Yet the story of Jonah and Lydia Blackwood did not vanish with the buildings. Their tale lingered, an echo of isolation, misinterpreted faith, and genetic consequence, resonating through the region and the medical literature that studied them. Local attitudes shifted over time. What was once whispered about in shame became a subject of academic inquiry. By the 1990s, the Blackwood case entered studies of rural sociology, genetic counseling, and ethics in public health. Dr. Eliza Cartwright observed, "The Blackwoods are now a cautionary example. A reminder of how geography, culture, and faith can intertwine with biology to create cycles nearly impossible to break. These lessons prevent future tragedies, even if the cost was immeasurable." Robert Campbell, the journalist who painstakingly pieced together the history, never published the book he had planned. In a 1985 interview, he explained why. "The more I learned, the less comfortable I felt sensationalizing their lives. These were real human beings caught in poverty, isolation, and misguided devotion. They were victims, not curiosities." The genetic legacy of the Blackwood family persisted quietly. Names were changed to protect survivors, yet studies in Appalachia in 2010 still identified patterns of rare disorders likely linked to the original lineage. Their isolation had left ripples through decades, a shadow lingering long after the compound crumbled. In 2015, developmental psychologist Dr. Rebecca Williams spoke with elderly residents who had attended school alongside Blackwood children in the 1940s. Their recollections are chilling. "They came to school dirty, strange-looking, the other kids called them hollow creatures. Eventually, they stopped coming. Their father said God would teach them. Looking back, we realize our cruelty drove them further into isolation when we could have offered help." Today, the former Blackwood property lies within a national forest. Its exact location is deliberately unmarked. Hikers occasionally stumble upon remnants, foundations overgrown with ivy, rusted nails, torn fragments of paper yellowed by decades. Few pause, and few understand the tragedy that unfolded there. Jonah and Lydia's story remains a warning: isolation, physical, cultural, and genetic, can distort human development and belief systems. Faith misapplied, coupled with generations of consanguinity, can make biological disaster almost inevitable. Yet beneath the horror, there is a deeply human element: people striving for meaning, for belonging, for purpose, however flawed their methods. Lydia's final years at Green Valley State Hospital were marked by devotion to the memory of her brother husband. She sang hymns, recited scripture, and tended her dolls as if they were her children. Faith Blackwood, her surviving daughter, had died young, her life a tragic endpoint to the consequences of Jonah's doctrine. Still, Lydia's mind created a sanctuary where her daughter lived, waiting to return and continue the sacred bloodline. Dr. Harrington explains the broader implications. The Blackwoods represent a rare but extreme convergence of social, religious, and genetic isolation. Each generation compounded risk, and their religious rationalization accelerated an already inevitable biological collapse. Cases like theirs inform genetic counseling, public health interventions, and our understanding of how human belief systems intersect with biology. Even decades later, medical researchers, anthropologists, and historians continue to examine the Blackwood case. It informs ethics courses, rural healthcare studies, and discussions about the consequences of isolation. The property itself is gone, but the story remains preserved in archives, journals, photographs, and oral history. The final act of the Blackwood saga is both sorrowful and profoundly human. A family trapped by geography, devotion, and biology, swept away by forces too large to control. Survivors scattered. Knowledge hidden. And yet, through these remnants, we glimpse the costs of extreme isolation, the fragility of the human body under generational stress, and the resilience of those who survived, even in shadowed corners of society. As hikers cross the old ridge, unaware of the human history beneath their boots, the mountains keep their secrets. The Blackwood story is a reminder: our choices, our beliefs, and our isolation have consequences that echo far beyond the visible horizon. If you have followed this story to its end, you understand its weight. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," and acknowledge the human tragedy hidden in these Appalachian hollows. Subscribe to uncover more forgotten chapters of American history, stories of resilience, tragedy, and truths conventional education often leaves untold. These are the echoes of those who lived and suffered, who loved and believed, and whose lives were shaped by forces beyond comprehension. Their tale lingers in the fog, in the abandoned foundations, and in the fragments of journals and photographs left behind, a stark testament to how isolation and faith can become intertwined with biology, shaping destinies in ways that are haunting, heartbreaking, and impossible to ignore.